Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Port in the Community panel. I'm Paula Copeland, Director of Communications and Corporate Social Responsibility with Port St. John. This panel will take a little bit different approach from the others you've heard today. We're going to talk a little bit about our port, but then we're going to look at some examples from ports around the world. Ports provide tremendous economic advantage to their regions, but also with that comes a little bit of tension as we all share to use waterfront for commercial and recreational residential needs. Today, I have two colleagues I've met through the organization called AiVP, and one's joining us from Germany, José Sánchez, and he is with AiVP. He is the International Projects Manager, and the other is Joye, who's joining us from Dublin. He's with Dublin Port Company. Each of them are going to share some information about other ports and how they're working with their local communities. But first, I wanted to share a little bit about our port, so I'll get our tech team to put my deck on. So at St. John, we have gone through about a 10-year process of building our community engagement, and it has evolved over that time to include our stakeholders and our community in an ever-widening outreach. A bunch of activities. It started with our inclusion model, of which this slide will begin to describe here, that in the beginning included the stakeholders that we are most closely working with on a day-to-day basis, and gathered information from them through twice yearly meetings and some committee meetings that specifically focused on very high-level files of interest to them. And then as time went by, next slide, we added in a feedback loop that included surveys, both internal and external surveys to our stakeholders, our community, our employees, and we continued to build our strategies and build our strategic plan around the inputs that we were receiving from all these various audiences. Next slide. Today, our inclusion model is very broad and it crosses our organization and is involved in many areas of the organization, including not only what comes out of the department that I'm most involved with, which would be on the community engagement front, but also we have emergency response planning that we collaborate with our community on. We have many events in the regular course of time in person, but of course now we're doing it virtually. And so we're continually trying to not only push out our information, but also bring our information back into the strategic planning, business planning processes at the port. So I don't want to take up too much time because really we want to learn from José and Lar. So I'm going to turn it over right now to José. And I must say, both of you, thank you for joining us very late in the day in your own time zones.
Well, hello, everybody. And first of all, thank you, Paula. Thank you, Port St. John, for inviting us to join this crucial debate about this topic. I don't have so much time because we want to have a bit of time for discussion, so we'll jump right into it. My name is José Sánchez, and as Paula said, I work for AiVP. So next slide, please. We are an NGO with global reach, and our main focus really is to share valuable knowledge about port-city interaction to help port authorities and municipalities in all continents to steer towards sustainable port-city relationships. We work with different experts and we also collaborate with different other organizations. So next, please. In very short, because I don't have so much time, we took a very important step in 2018 when we launched the AiVP Agenda 2030. And what we did was adapt the 17 SDGs from the United Nations into the concept of port-city interaction. Today, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I strongly invite the audience to have a look at our website and have a look at the document because we think it sets the route for sustainable port-city interaction. And I know that the Port of St. John is already exploring this document, is working with it, as some recent articles can show us. But today I wanted to focus on some key ideas that are transversal to all these goals. But before that, so next slide, please. I think it's important to comment very briefly on what we have seen in a global scale regarding the port-city relationship. And first of all, it's important to acknowledge that it is not an easy relationship very often. It implies certain tensions, and this is somehow inevitable because there are different ideas of what may happen and different expectation of what could happen in the waterfront, in the port city interface. And of course, there are many actors involved in this, and there are many different type of concerns. Next, please. But what we have seen as well in the recent years is that there has been a global evolution in terms of the development priorities of the actors that are involved in this relationship, particularly port authorities. From a very strong focus on economic performance and economic and logistic results, we see that gradually the environmental and social issues are taken more into consideration. And these can be seen in different documents, official documents from different organizations, including ours. And this is also reflected, this in its sense, then also reflects the evolution of the role of ports in the territory in society, from a very clear economic focus in which it was considered an economic and logistic hub, to a broader role in terms of being a value generator for the surrounding territory. So this is, of course, something to explore. This is what we have seen in our experience over the past 30 years. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going a bit fast because we don't have so much time. Later in the questions, please feel free to ask. I will be happy to answer the best I can. The main idea that I want to highlight today, using some examples, is about the cooperation between port authorities, municipalities, and the different actors. And the key idea behind this is to establish a shared port city vision. And this is what we consider is a very crucial first step for the cooperation between port and cities, because it will establish an agreement and a coherent vision to what can happen and should happen in the shared port city territory. So next, please. And it is also an opportunity, besides the rules, to explore different functions that can take place in the waterfront. And here with examples is the case of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, a very big port, where port and city are working together, proposing new functions for certain areas of the port territory that are connected to maritime activities. This is the Makers District, what they call, and it has two main areas. One is the RDM campus, so research and development facility that joins and connects the academic world and the research world to the with entrepreneurs and helps them in launching startups for maritime solutions. And the other one is what is called the M4H area, which is a hybrid section, we could say, where port and city functions are combined, particularly also allowing different kind of innovative manufacturing related to circular economy. And we can find many examples in other places. Next slide, please. Another examples that I also like to use very often is the case of Marseille in the south of France. I think this is relevant because here port and city work together for several years in a dialogue, debate, and negotiation, and it was not easy, but eventually they found an agreement that is you can see in the Port City Charter, where the rules for the interaction and the result of the negotiation are clearly put there. And it's interesting because, again, it offers the possibility of combining port and city uses, both in the scale of the planning, but also in the architectural solutions that were later found, in which port and city uses are combined also vertically. And later we can discuss these in more detail. So next, please. Because before, instead of showing Marseille, I wanted to show another example. And this is the case of Porto in the north of Portugal. Here they built a new cruise terminal, and besides its landmarkish architecture, it's a very beautiful and elegant building. It's also relevant because it combines vertically in the different floors the passenger functions, we could say, with others connected to the urban side, such as a research facility and laboratories of the local university focusing on marine biology. And this is interesting because it also makes the project a bit more sustainable in the longer term, because it guarantees that there is all year long activities in the building, besides other areas such as open air amphitheater in the roof. So next, please. And now, because I don't have so much time, this is the final point that I wanted to make, is that in the AiVP, we defend the creation already for some years of port centers as spaces or forums, physical spaces that host a forum where port city citizens can establish a dialogue, an informed dialogue, to learn about the demands of each other, to help the citizens to understand a bit better what implies to have a port and what are the potentials of the ports, what are the key debates that can take place, and also to get direct information. And this, of course, connects with the establishment, with the creation of a shared port city visions in which the citizens must also play an important role. And this is, of course, a key tool, in our opinion. The port centers are a key tool to establish a co-creation process of this vision. So you can, next please. But in short, this is a bit, in just 4 or 5 minutes, some glances of what we consider is relevant, and it's important steps towards sustainable port city interaction. And we are here in an email to answer your questions the best way we can. So thank you.
Thank you, Jose, very much for that. And of course, great examples there from various perspectives, from architectural and incorporation for the cruise industry to the community and citizen interaction at a port center, and also including the academic and research capacities, and the first one at Rotterdam. And we're going to turn it over now to Lar, who's going to share what Dublin Port Company has been up to in this realm. Very interesting work that's going on there. So take it away, Lar.
Thank you very much. My talk, I just want to kind of, I've broken it into 2 parts. One is just to kind of contextualize the port, explain where it is, and the kind of traditional approach we took to about 2010, where we annoyed our neighbours and local communities, and the changes that have occurred since 2010. So Alec, if you go to the first slide. So the port's been around for a long period of time, since 1707, so it's well over 300 years old. 60% of all goods coming in and out of Ireland come through the port, so it has a very dominant position compared to other ports around the island. But you can see it has a very long lineage and has really dominated the city since the 1700s. Today, since 1997, it's what we call a semi-state body. It's not the civil service, but it's a commercial semi-state, and it's a landlord port. It's running the facilities of the port, which I'll talk about later. Alec, next slide. And from this image, you can see how it has dominated the city. What this is showing is how much of the Dublin Bay has been filled in by the Port Authority since 1707. So the map that you're looking at, everything that's in sand or a brown color has been filled in. So when you're in the city today, in the central part of it, you are actually on land that has been taken back from the sea. So the physical structure, the way the city looks, has been because of the port. And this comes down to the bridges. We have bridges crossing our famous river, the Liffey. And why there are so few bridges is because the port insisted on keeping the bridges limited, because the port wanted more space to land ships. So even 100 years later, after the last sailing ship, we're still limited in the number of bridges that we have crossing the Liffey. Next slide, please. This again just shows you the kind of a more romantic review of that expansion eastwards as the city went out into the bay and kept going further and further and further. Next slide, Alex. And in this one from about 100 years ago, you can see how near the port is. That red mark is our main capital street. That is O'Connell Street, the main street of Dublin. And that's how near it is to the port. And 100 years ago, the port, in many ways, it reached its peak. It was connected by an amazing network of trains around the country. And you could go from the west coast of Ireland to London within 12 hours by train, then by fast ferry to Holyhead, and then by fast express train from Holyhead down to London. So even 100 years ago, Dublin was a very, very connected city. Nowadays, of course, we fly everywhere. Next slide, please. In the 1990s, part of the older part of the port, nearer to the city, became unusable for the port. So that was handed over to a new organization that created what we've seen around all other cities, a docklands area, and the port facilities went out into the deeper water, which is quite understandable. And this area now is kind of full of companies like Google, Facebook have their European headquarters now in Dublin. But the port itself isn't in this area anymore. Next slide. Up to 2010, the port over a 40-year period had continued trying to expand into the bay. And the area of red that's marked there just shows you an area that was going to be filled in. And then the engineers within the port spent 40 years going through various planning appeals to get it to happen. And eventually in 2010, it was overturned. And the port was told that you could no longer expand, that you are surrounded by nature reserves and you must consider those in any of your planning. So that was a major shock to the company, because prior to that, it was very much build, build, build. And there was a lot of friction, as I mentioned earlier on, between the communities and the people who live nearby and the port. And that was a big shock in 2010. I just want to go into, next slide, please, just 3 quick slides to show you the various companies that are working here in the port. We have competing companies when it comes to ro-ro lines connecting between Liverpool and Holyhead to the United Kingdom, or as some of my colleagues, of course, Holyhead is in Wales. Next slide, please. And we also then have lo-lo terminals, 3 competing lo-lo terminals. But the big change that's occurring in relation to Brexit and our relationship with the United Kingdom is the European connection. Next slide, please. Which is containers on ro-ro. These are direct links from Dublin to Rotterdam and Zeebrugge. They've gone from 2 ships a week to now 14 ships a week. Very large ships bringing ro-ro directly with no drivers, just the trailers and containers. And that's the huge sea change that we're starting to see in Dublin, that we've been very reliant to the UK since independence in 1922, and now we're seeing direct links around the UK to Europe. As you know, with Brexit, UK has decided to leave European Union. So that's a major change and a big one for Ireland. One that's, over the last 1,000 years, our link is very, very firmly with the United Kingdom, and that is quite dramatically changed. Next slide, please. So what happened in 2010 was a change in the port. In 2012, a master plan was released, and in that master plan, it set out, which you can find on our website very clearly, that the port needed to modernize, it needed to improve capacity, but at the same time, it needed to see its links with the city as equally as important. So when we're talking to our colleagues in engineering, we're continuously emphasizing the fact that capacity is essential for the profitability of the company and for the island, but also that integration with our local communities and with our city is essential, one that had broken down over a 40-year period from the 1960s to 2010. And ironically, the structures that were built by the port, these 2 walls that you see in this photograph, were built and finalized in 1820, are still keeping the port open because Dublin Bay is a very shallow, sandy bay. And by using these 2 walls, the River Liffey flushes out all the sand and keeps a natural dredge for the port. So ironically, we're reliant on 200-year-old Victorian engineering to keep ourselves open today. What I want to do now, and I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a few slides just going through the various projects that we're involved in when it looks at how we work with our communities in the greater Dublin area. We got the next slide, please. My background is coming from a collections background, working in archives and museums. So we have a wonderful 300-year-old archive that has an immense visual representation of the city, 70,000 photographs and 30,000 engineering drawings that we're starting to use in programming and are planning to create an archive building and museum to display these, to show off the kind of the visual delight in many ways of what we have in our collections. Next slide, please. We're very much geared to using our website, and our social media is very, very active. We do make a lot of videos to communicate what we're doing. And like yourselves, we've kind of transitioned to Zoom. We have a Zoom lecture next Thursday, one of the series that we've been running for the last 3 weeks. We've also created a specific website looking at this debate of what happens after our master plan comes to an end, Dublin Port Post 2040, where our chief executive has written a series of essays looking at why the port is here in Dublin, because a common debate or argument is made in Ireland, we can solve a housing issue if we move the port. And the argument is a simple one, and the answer is a lot more complicated, which we've set out in that website and publication, which has been very, very useful. Next slide, please. Looking at the physical kind of impact, we've set up a series of heritage projects. Here you have a diving bell that was used to build the port from the 1860s to the 1960s. And we've turned it and lifted it up off the ground and built a museum underneath to explain how this was used, how it operated. So a piece of industrial heritage neglected on the quay wall for many years has been turned into a museum which receives 100,000 visitors a year now, go in there prior to pandemics, of course, to see and learn about the port, which is, again, not inside the port today, but in that older part of the port where the docklands and the offices are. Next slide, please. And again, around our own port center, our headquarters, we've created a maritime garden. We've broken down the wall, that physical barrier that was there, that kind of security mandated a big Victorian wall between the port and the city. And we've broken that down with these steel gates and also installed one of our last heavy industrial cranes. Again, inviting people into our port center to get people to come in, use the garden. And this area of the docklands does not have many green spaces. Next slide, please. Again, traditionally ferries and small ferries were used on the river. The last one closed down in 1980. We've reinstalled and rebuilt that last ferry to turn it into a taxi service on the river. So again, getting the citizens of Dublin who've lost contact with the port back on the water to realize what it's like to be on the Liffey, because again, people don't interact anymore. They don't see the ships being unloaded where we are at the edge of the city, but bringing them onto the Liffey ferry has broken that down. And once we're back to normal after COVID, we're now going to do tours into the port in between sailings of the various ro-ro and lo-lo operators to get people to see the port from the sea. Next slide, please. And again, we've been working with a famous Irish and internationally famous architectural firm called Grafton Architects about how we visualize the future for the port. And they've come up with this greening element. Around the edges of the port, we're going to build greenways connecting ourselves back into the city, but also taking away some of that harshness that we associate with the edges and fringes of ports. And then a series of heritage sites within the port, again, in the heart of a very bustling and busy port, that people can come into safely on their bike, engage and see what's happening, have a cup of coffee, have an experience either in a theatre or in a concert, and then cycle out of the port. Next slide, please. This is a wonderful image of just kind of showing that connectivity back into the city that Grafton Architects created, a 1.4 kilometre greenway along the fringe of the city between the two blue areas, the Liffey at the south, and then at the north is the Talca rivers, and then another over 4 kilometre greenway along the edges, which is again a wonderful way of breaking down that harshness. Next slide, please. And again, this is another visual from Grafton Architects, kind of gives you that greening effect that you kind of appreciate what we're trying to do in the area. Next slide, please, Alec. This year in October or in August, we'll be opening a pump house and graving docks heritage zone, which is an area where shipbuilding used to take place. That area's had to close down to deal with the new capacity for the port. But we've created a 6-acre area within that, preserving some of the older buildings to show some of that area that was used for shipbuilding. And you can see a connectivity back into our greenways and roads that people come in, avoid having to go through a very busy and dangerous port, which kind of security requirements, health and safety requirements, will bring you right middle into it, into that area that you can see on the image, where we'll have ships, pump houses and cranes on display. Next slide, please. And again, this is just to show you when we talk about greenway, it's very much a greening of that fringe along the Talca River there, finishing off in a very large linear park, which will give again a new view for people. And at the same time, for people working in the port will use this greenway to come into port to go to work, rather than going down roads, which again, it can be very hostile, can be very heavy with truck traffic. And again, it's a way of getting the people working in the company, but also the various tenants to get into the port safely. Next slide. And within the center of the port is a former flour mill, which no longer is in use. And we've taken over that flour mill. Working Grafton Architects, we're going to reorientate that and make that a center point of allowing people into the port. The center building, as you can see there, is 15 stories high. And when you're on top of the building, you have a bird's eye view of the city behind you, but also the sea to the front, but also you can see the mountains that surround the city. on a clear day. So quite a spectacular view. But it also allows citizens to come into the port and see how a port operates, because that link with people passing ships, seeing ships being unloaded that you would have seen in the 70s has gone completely with containerization. But from here at the 15 stories, you can actually look in and see how things are working. Next slide, please. That's an interior of the Great Hall, which will be attached to the flour mill. Next slide, please. One of the key things is working with our local communities. We've also established a Port Perspectives cultural program, working with local artists and with the Abbey Theatre, the famous Irish theatre company, and other theatre companies to create interesting work inside the port. Next slide, please. Dublin Ships was an installation that we did on one of our old Shizer bridges. Again, working with an artist. Every time a new ship came into the port, the name of the ship would jump up on these screens. And again, it's that connectivity that people suddenly realize that there are ships coming in and out the whole time, and became a hugely popular art installation. And we're hoping this year to reinstall it because it did prove to be so popular. Next slide. Working with the National Concert Hall, we in 2016, a key decade or key date of commemoration for Ireland due to the 1916 Rising, we screened but also held a Starboard Home concert, which has gone online, has now been turned into a documentary, and commissioned a series of new songs linking the port and the city, and about the Liffey and the water and our bay, which proved very, very popular, and again can be seen on our YouTube channel. Next slide, please. Then last year at the height of COVID, we did online theatre shows with those 5 plays based in the pump house and in the heritage zone. You can see some of the dramatic photos there. And that proved very, very popular in the winter when we went into our second lockdown and we were able to screen those live. Again, we're going to be bringing some of those back now that we're slowly coming out of our third lockdown. Next slide, please. And this is going to be our big project once the Heritage Zone opens in August, is that we're going to have a site-specific theatre show with two very famous Irish theatre companies, and New Productions and Landmark Productions, bringing people into the port to learn about what happened in Dublin during our War of Independence, when we gained independence in 1922, and how the port was also vital to that period of war, and how it impacted on the city, on the port, which will be an exciting way for us to launch the new Heritage Zone, but also leads us into up to Christmas as we come out of this lockdown and can actually have a live audience coming into the center of the port. Next slide. And like José, that's my contact details. You can find more information on the dublinportarchive.com website, but also the Dublin Port Company's own website. And if you want to catch up anything we're doing, I highly recommend our YouTube channel, which has a series of videos and kind of gives you a visual idea of what we're doing and some of the projects we're involved in. So hopefully I didn't go over too long there.
No, it was great. It was wonderful to see all those examples. I know here in St. John, I can see echoes of some of the things that we've done on a different scale, and some of the things that we talk about as a future dream. So it was really great to see that. Right now, I think José is going to help us out by posing some questions from our discussion that we had earlier on when we were preparing for this. And I want to thank José for helping me pick Lar as our example for coming to talk today, because I can see why you chose to pair up Dublin Port Company with us when we're thinking about our future plans. So go ahead. So José, it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Yeah, indeed, I'm lucky enough to know the case of Dublin relatively well. We've worked together in some occasions. I remember seeing the plan for the Greenway and the flour mill at the beginning of the process. It was a fascinating planning development, and I really look forward to see how it's going to turn out. But I think what Lar just showed us kind of highlights what I was saying before regarding the evolution of the role of the port in society and in the region, in the local region, because we see even with new professional profiles joining port authorities, that is not just about the cargo and the logistic activities, which of course are the core business of the port. I mean, this is undeniable. It is a nationally important infrastructure that has a very key role in the logistic change. We have seen it also during the pandemic, that it was one of the activities that couldn't stop. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that, as we also do in the AiVP agenda, with one of the goals highlighting the port cultural and the identity value that it has for the port city. So I was wondering, because Lara, I know that you joined not so long ago the Port Authority compared to other engineers that have spent their career. So I was wondering if you could tell us how you have seen this evolution arriving from outside of the traditional port professions, and what you have seen from the moment you join in until what you are working on now. How do you valorize and how do you explain this evolution?
Well, I grew up in Dublin, so I grew up near to the port. And even as a child, I realized, even listening to my parents, but also in my own local community, that the port was strongly disliked. It had become rather arrogant and had filled in large parts of the bay in opposition to the communities around it. So the relationship from the 70s, as I said, is not just one that we can document in the archive or even on the newspapers. It was very, very, very real for the communities around the port. So a very strained one. And then from about the late 1980s, the port disappeared because it went to the furthest, it went to the deep water, as everyone in ports understands. You go to the deep water. The derelict older part then was, over a 20-year period, handed over to a government agency that then redeveloped it. And that's what you saw, that kind of change. But the port in our mind kind of disappeared. And the other big change in Ireland as an island nation is, traditionally when I was a teenager, if you wanted to go to Europe, you went on the ferry. Everyone had a very bad experience on the ferry. It was kind of a rite of passage as a teenager. And then suddenly Ryanair arrived around 1992. And sadly have now imposed themselves on the whole rest of Europe. But Ryanair, my kids have never been on a ferry. So there's no reason to go to the port anymore to go on a ferry. You fly off the island. And now we have a very, very sophisticated and quite a big airport, which is kind of taken over. So there's no reason to be in the port unless you are working here or you're working for one of the companies that works here. So what I've learned over since coming here in 2017 is that, you know, what you're seeing now within the local communities is there's a very transparent process where our chief executive and the management team have engaged through a master planning process and also through the planning process, very clear on what they're trying to do. They're not trying to fill in the bay. They're not trying to pull a fast one. And that's, you know, I've worked in other organizations. Once a trust is broken down, it takes many, many years to fix. So hopefully, again, I'm kind of talking from inside the company. Our relationships are a lot stronger with those communities than they were 30 years ago. Trust has been rebuilt. And I think it's key, as I was saying in the talk, that, you know, we get people down because there's very little reason to be down here. So the greenways and the connectivity into it, I've worked on museum projects before where we built museums and people haven't come. You have to kind of, you can build a modern museum, but if you haven't got the connectivity and the programming to go with it, it turns into a hard slog then to convince people to come in. So the connectivity for me is equally as important as getting people into that 15-story building to see into the port. And then it raises bigger questions. You know, we are heavily reliant on importing huge amounts of goods into this country. Is that environmentally right? So.
Yeah, I think in the end also when people can visit the port also kind of give them the opportunity to look at the backstage of the world if we want, because we're very used to just being in the shop, going to the supermarket, getting what we need and so on. But in the end, also getting to know the port is a bit better, getting to know how our society works and getting to understand a bit the role of the different elements that allow us to have a relatively comfortable life or everyday life. I mean, if we look at our everyday things, you know, the phones or computer and so on, they wouldn't be here without these functions.
And then, in particular for an island nation, I mean, we're an island nation, so everything comes on a boat. I mean, and I think that's my big takeaway over the last 4 years is that we were heavily reliant on transporting everything from Europe and from the UK.
I don't know, Paula, if we have time, but I wanted to ask just Lara, if you could explain very briefly one aspect of one of the projects. Because if I remember correctly, in the flour mill project, you're also planning on including several one port function, not just the cultural side, but also one key infrastructure of the port, right, in the same building.
Yeah, so our VTS, our Harbour Master's office, and the VTS are going to be on top of that building also, because it has the best views of the water. I mean, that's, and then where they are in their current office is within our master plan, there's 3 phases to capacity improvement. So phase 1 is just about to come to an end. Phase 2 then will see that building where they're in at the moment knocked and that area changed. And we're about to go to planning for phase 3, or we're in the process of the planning permission for next year. So we're in that kind of design phase. So yeah, it's key to bring the Harbour Master and his team into that area. And the area, as I say, the views are spectacular. I know some VTSs are in buildings are almost underground, but this one will have a spectacular view. And I think from talking to the people there, they're keen to be able to physically see as well as relying on the equipment that they have. So yeah, no, we're trying to kind of make sure that, and we have the space there to kind of use the buildings in a variety of ways. So it's also for the port company, for the facilities that we have, and also then for the visitor to come into the space and use it. It could be going into a museum exhibition, or it could be going to a theatre show, or it could be simply just going to the top of the building, having lunch and having a cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And so was that a thought or consideration prior to thinking of building this museum? Was there always the plan to put the VTS there, or like which basically came first, the chicken or the egg?
No, as our chief executive says, these things kind of evolve. I mean,
Yeah.
José was here recently, 2 years ago. We were talking about 1 greenway, and since then we now have 2 greenways. And what happened there was we were developing the 1 greenway, and then we decided how are we going to get people to that greenway, and we realized that we needed a second one. So similarly to the VTS question, it's these things kind of evolve. And within discussions within the organization, and then when you go outside and say when you're doing planning consultations, people come back with questions and they raise ones that you maybe haven't thought about. So there has to be a discussion, and no one with any company can say they have all the answers. That a lot of this is evolving, and that greenway, this time last year was a thought, and then we commissioned Grafton Architects. It's 10 meters of land on the edge of the port has been given over. So that's quite, as everyone there knows. I mean, within ports, to give away 10 meters of land anywhere in a port is quite a big chunk of land, and that's a kind of straight line up. So yeah, it's continuously evolving, and I don't think you can start as the master plan did in 2012 and have all the answers up for 10 years later. But what you can do, and as I said, the 2 key elements is that we need to improve capacity. We can't affect the nature reserves or the biosphere, UNESCO designated biosphere that's around us, and we have to improve the relationship with the city. And if we have those 2 kind of strands have allowed us to evolve and kind of analyze everything as we're going along.
Very interesting.
Paula, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, I do have one, and it came earlier today, but we decided to bring it up in this, and it was directed to the port about our plans to invest in what they called off-port infrastructure, or infrastructure that will help the community buffer zones and between our activity and what happens at the port and what the community needs are. And certainly we've here at the port been working towards doing this on a case-by-case basis for quite some time. We partnered with our city and a couple of other agencies a number of years ago to permit a large and very popular walkway called Harbor Passage that nearly circles the whole perimeter of the port. The only part that it doesn't go into is the west side, where our container terminal is, and really there's no ability to go onto the waterfront there, but it covers a large part of the area that's outside of that zone. And then we've been on a case-by-case basis as projects come forward. We've been supporting them. For example, we have an extension that we put on for Canada 150 that takes people out to the edge of a pier that we have here, that they can look right out into the harbor and get a great view of the activity. That's part of that Harbor Passage Trail now, but it's an extension. Since we did that, there's been a couple of other entities that have come forward and invested in either monuments, ones to our military service, and another one that's related, that's coming also to the naval service. And then later this year, we're going to have a recreated fort that would have been representative of a fort that was built during the period of French habitation in this region, that's going to open up, but it's going to honor that French period. It's going to honor our First Nations and later on English habitation in the region. So these projects, as they come, and festivals and events that create long-lasting pieces on the waterfront like sculptures, we're supporting them in that way. So we're going to continue to look for those opportunities. And then on the west side of our port, which is, as I say, more commercial industrial with our container terminal, we've been helping the community center that's adjacent to our port entrance to develop community gardens. They have a splash pad there for the nice days in the summer for that community of children and families to go down and use. So as time and opportunity presents, we are working towards those things as well. We will continue to look for those opportunities in the future. And just to answer that question from earlier today, it is something that we are very interested in and definitely want to keep doing. So.
Great. Jose and myself, just when we were in the green room, we're just saying we would love to be there today. It's a shame, but someday.
Yes. Well, it's a beautiful day too. Unusually warm for this early in June for us.
Well, in Europe, we've got a very cold winter, so winter only ended last week. So.
Oh dear. Yeah. No, it was I think close to 30 with humidity here yesterday. So it was nice. And then you'd also get our lobster dinner, which we would have normally tonight too. So.
Yeah, Zoom cannot reply that.
No, it can't. So
No,
we're coming down to like a minute and a half. I don't know, Jose, if we have another question that we want to sort of look at.
Yeah, I think just really to highlight another thing that I was thinking about when Lara was talking, and something that we have also seen increasingly, is the recovery of the connection with the people, and we insist as well, not just to have this institutional connection between the different stakeholders, but also to have a more direct connection with the people, and for that also social media helps a lot. And I remember from the case of Dublin when I was there, I remember also talking about this and how the port employees were eventually really sort of ambassadors and will explain the port even better than what the Port Authority can do. And I think in the case of Dublin, I think it was the harbor master, I think, that he was also very active. So it was very interesting to see how even the way we communicate has gradually evolved in that sense. But also in terms of the archives, I remember also that there was this connection with the roots of the people. There was something called the list of names, right?
You know, I mean, the port is a huge employer. So there's a huge social, what we call a social history that people are fascinated with. And then you have the kind of the traditional stories of dockers. I mean, the dockers in Dublin were a tough group of people, and suddenly late 1960s, it all kind of started to unravel for them. So people are fascinated in learning about that history, about their families. There's a key point that you brought up earlier on, is that ports now have a variety of professional people coming into them. And in particular with Captain McKenna, our harbour master, he's a very, very natural lecturer and gives regular lectures, and he's proved very, very, very popular in his talks and interviews. And I think that's needed, you know, in Oprah. We need everyone kind of being comfortable or learning how to kind of give their own presentation about what they do, because once people within a port explain what they do, the citizens in Dublin are fascinated by it, and again, it opens a window where they just they don't have that connectivity anymore. Mm. So the archive is providing one kind of source of kind of information for people. A lot of inquiries coming in, and it's that kind of link with family over the last 300 years. And again, with all archives, sometimes we have the information, sometimes we don't. And then, but also for the employees of the company, it's essential. And the final element is that, like many port companies, we actually have more retired people than we have working in the port today. So the company itself is 160 staff. There's about 5,000 people working as tenants for the tenant companies and the ferry companies. But we have about 400 pensioners. So we're very keen to work with them to get their history, their oral history, but also to ask them to become tour guides in our new heritage zone, because they've lived it. They kind of have that understanding.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's key to connect with the people in that way for sure. I know when we started our program 10 years ago, it was a realization of our CEO who's new on the scene at the time. And he said, you know, when he grew up in St. John, the port was dinner table conversation. But because over time, the ways that we handle cargo and the ways that the port worked required less and less people. So you had less and less people connected to that activity. So we had to reawaken that. And that's one of the things we tried to set out to do over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's important if the people do not come to the port goes to meet the people almost.
Exactly.
Philosophy, I would say. It's something that, if you look at it from a historical perspective, you see that there was a very organic relationship with the port activities, and it has a very strong influence even in societal structure. But then this, of course, breaks in the 20th century, and now that we have to make extra efforts to recover this connection. And I think it's really necessary, because in the end, it is a crucial part of the port city identity and the history of the people.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both. Our time is up, and I'm going to have to say goodbye for today, but I know I'll see you again, and hopefully next time it'll be in person somewhere. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, and my name is Jim Quinn. I'm CEO for Port St. John, and I want to start our closing remarks by first thanking the over 500 people who have taken part in today's event. Today we covered, through 5 sessions, we covered a number of topics. We began the day looking at infrastructure and infrastructure investments and how infrastructure would create opportunity. And we looked at how do we need to grow a workforce to have that workforce in place to take full advantage of the opportunities that come with increased infrastructure. And how do we make that workforce perform in a way that is sustainable in helping to grow our economy? We then looked at data and information, surely the foundation of the efficiency of transportation systems and our port, because that is so important in having an effective supply chain. And of course, this afternoon, we looked at cruise resumption and both afloat and ashore, and how important our cruise industry is to not only Port St. John and ports across Canada and across the world, but how they are important to the city and how they're important to the region. There are so many people whose livelihoods are tied to cruise, and we're looking forward to the resumption of cruise in the coming year. We also looked at ports in our community, and I want to thank José and Lara for taking part in this afternoon's session. Given the time change or time difference between St. John, New Brunswick and their locations. Certainly AiVP is an important organization that unites ports and cities, and we're a proud member of that organization and continue to look to learn from them on how we can perform even better here in St. John. And the examples in the discussion that Lara presented was excellent. After all, we are the most Irish city in Canada, so it's just great to have a colleague from Ireland talk to us about the experiences that they've had in Ireland and in Dublin. I also want to remind folks that we'll be emailing both a post-event survey and a link to a recording of today's session to all registrants. And we hope that you'll share your feedback with us as we work to continue to improve our events. We thank you for the questions that have been submitted. If your question wasn't responded to, I know the team is planning to reach out with the information for you. I also want to thank our Port St. John team and our technical team from our partners at Encore and Pretzel as well of the hard work that they did in putting on what I believe has been a very well organized and successful event. I want to thank our sponsors, DP World, CP, CN, JDI Transportation and Logistics, Stuart McAlvey, ourselves, Port St. John, and of course, 97.3 The Wave and Country 94 FM. We'll be making a $16,000 donation to our St. John Seafarers mission in honor of our speakers today and on behalf of our virtual Port Day event sponsors. It goes without saying the work of the Seafarers mission is very, very important, particularly during the past year when the men and women who serve on our ships that call in Port St. John have often been on board those ships for over a year. So thank you to all of our sponsors. 10 years ago, we began a journey to put our port back on our local stage, but also on the global shipping stage, a place we historically occupied. Creating a vision with several initiatives have guided us over these past years. We and our partners have put in place all of the elements that will achieve the success we envisioned 10 years ago. And you heard our panelists outline their plans to advance that success, helping Port St. John grow in unity with the growth of our city, our province, and indeed our economy. Our future is bright, and at Port St. John, we look forward to having a live in-person event in June of 2022, combined, of course, with our world-class seafood fiesta that you have heard a few times today. So with that, I want to thank again the organizers and all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us here. Thank you very much.